So in the light of current conversations regarding sex, sexuality and gender, particularly in the church and even more particularly in the Methodist Church, I thought it might be valuable to take a deeper look at how the text of the Old Testament views some aspects of these matters. Not least because it's all too easy to assume that our Western cultural understanding has historically had a good handle on what these texts originally intended to say. But also because it's all too easy to assume that there will be a simple division between conservatives and evangelicals who, on the one hand, will take the text literally, and liberals and progressives who, on the other hand, will disregard the text as irrelevant in this day and age. I don't think either of those assumptions are either helpful or true in that simplistic way. We all live with subtle, complex, nuanced differences across that spectrum. And people across all theological traditions are often deeply dedicated to the Bible and are passionate about exploring the truths that we all find within it. And we can all also be guilty of being slightly dishonest with ourselves about how true we actually are to the hermeneutical standpoint we claim to have. That is to say, we may each claim to have an approach to the Bible with a particular attitude, but in truth we all change our approach day by day on the basis of many different influences from all sorts of things in our lives. It's all too easy to use our chosen theological camp as a defence against hearing the wisdom, the challenges, the concerns and questions of our brothers and sisters of other traditions. In the end, we all have the same text to wrestle with, and wrestle with them we should. When I began this study, all I intended to do was write a blog post. There were various people arguing on the internet about the questions of same-sex marriage, and I wanted to say something that was more substantial than just a fake Facebook post or a tweet. Maybe something spanning 3 or 4 paragraphs. I wanted to put forward a more detailed analysis of some of the biblical references that people were throwing into the argument. Now, I'm no expert on the subject, but I knew a few things that were being ignored in the argument, so I wanted to set out what I thought I knew. And so as I started to write, I realised that I had to check some of the things that I was saying to see if they were true, or at least had the possibility of being true. And I had to collect together all the things that I had been thinking about, and I realised there was a lot more to it than I had originally thought. And that's where my journey began. From there the task expanded to these videos that you will see, and to what is expanding to be, I think, a book, or at least a short book at this stage. We'll see where it goes to. So this is my attempt at wrestling with some of the issues of sex, sexuality and gender in the Old Testament. It's not my intention within this to set out what I think about the subject in general, or how I think we ought to interpret the words of Scripture for our generation. It's primarily my intention within this project to explore something of how the ancient texts behaved in their original languages, or particularly Hebrew, and more specifically to ask what insights we might have lost or temporarily mislaid in translation. And the first thing I want to say about translation is that the task of translation is one that is fraught with difficulties. And though the translator nearly always has both good intentions and expert skills, every translation is done with a particular set of purposes in mind. Those purposes skew the finished product in one direction or another. One of the primary decisions that any translator has to make is where their translation will sit on the scale from being true to the original text and being really clear and comprehensible to the reader. Some texts that we may read may lend themselves to an easy relationship between those two extremes. For example, if someone had the task of translating from something from American English to British English, or proper English, there would be almost no occasions for complete misinterpretations of meaning. Yet the translator might still need to ponder over whether to maintain the original American words like hood and sidewalk, or translate them as bonnet and pavement. The easy thing would be putting the U's in the word colour. But as you can imagine, with such an ancient language as Biblical Hebrew, the struggles are often far more extreme. Not only are the words different, the letters are different too. Not only is the grammar different, but also we have to rely on vowels and punctuation that was added more than 1,000 years after the original texts were written down, in most cases. Idioms and common phrases that evoke one thing in one language may mean something completely different or nothing at all in another language. Oh, there's helicopters going over. So we might say that this is just the way the cookie crumbles. But would that make sense in your language? Meaning is important when our sense of humanity is at stake. Any translation needs to make at least some sense in the language into which it is being translated, and most translators of the Bible work hard to achieve this. There are often subtle variations based on who the intended readership might be. There are also variations brought about by the ever-changing nature of our own modern languages. All good translation needs to make some sense in the context of the culture in which it is being read. But the trouble with this is that any translator will always be influenced by some sense of what we think people might have meant. The more we try to make sense of the text, the more that text is influenced by the culture and the language into which it's being translated. This is why it's right for every generation to return to the original languages of the Bible particularly, and ask if there is anything from this generation and from this culture that can add to our understanding. Is there anything that others have missed, or anything that that others have incorrectly or inadvertently added along the way? This generation may, of course, add its own errors, and that's something we have to live with. But at best, a good translator translates with all the benefits of the generations that have gone before them, as well as the new understandings that can be found in their own generation. And hopefully they never translate in the isolation of their own time, or in the assumption that only their view is the right one.